So in this lecture, we're going to talk about advanced editing strategies that you can use for the research paper. First, I want to talk about using other punctuation marks. So a lot of times people forget about other punctuation marks like semicolons and colons, dashes, hyphens, and all of these other tools in your toolkit. Go back and look at a lecture that I've posted underneath this video about other punctuation marks. I find the most common mistake, or maybe the most frightening punctuation mark for students, is the semicolon. The bottom line, if you don't want to look at that lecture, the bottom line for using a semicolon is this: when you have two complete sentences that are connected together that have equal weight or carry equal weight. So the first part of the sentence and the second part of the sentence carry equal weight. You can use a semicolon instead of a period. So think of a semicolon kind of like a weak period. But what comes on the first side of the semicolon and what comes on the other side of the semicolon, both of those things have to be complete sentences. It just suggests that those sentences are connected somehow and that they're of equal value. Use a colon for three situations when you're going to include a list, an explanation, or a quotation. So hopefully that demystifies the difference between those two. If you have questions about those other punctuation marks, like when to use dashes, when to use brackets, please take a look at that lecture. I have a picture of spices here because I like to think of punctuation marks kind of like spices. You want to use not just salt and pepper, the basic punctuation marks like periods and commas. You also want to use all sorts of other punctuation marks in the same way that you would use a variety of spices when you're cooking. Also, learn comma rules. So go back and look at my lecture about the 6 comma rules if you're kind of unclear or fuzzy about using commas. A lot of people just sprinkle commas throughout their essay whenever they feel that there needs to be a pause. That is not when and why you want to use a comma. Most of the time, there's actually a hard and fast rule for whether or not to use a comma. There are 6 basic comma rules. So please look at that lecture if you find yourself just randomly sprinkling commas throughout your essay and you're not really sure why. My quick tip here is before the word which, generally, most of the time you have a comma because what comes after it is non-essential or extra information. Before the word that, most of the time you don't have a comma. That's a very common error that I see, so I thought I would just address it really quickly right here. And you'll see that I've included this cartoon that shows how important commas are. My heroes are my parents, comma, Superman, and Wonder Woman. So if you don't use that Oxford comma, it looks as if your parents are superheroes. If you do use the Oxford comma, it's clear that you have 3 different heroes, right? Your parents, or I guess that's 2 heroes, Superman and Wonder Woman. So 4 heroes actually. So commas matter. Another tip is to use sentence variety. Use different types of sentences in your paragraph. So vary the rhythm. Alternate between short sentences and long sentences. Short sentences are not powerful unless you have complex or complex compound sentences near them, right? A very short sentence like, "it's not okay," isn't really powerful on its own or in a text message, but in an academic essay surrounded by sentences that are elegant and complex, a very short to the point sentence like, "it's not okay," can actually be quite powerful as long as you're varying the rhythm. Look at your paper, just eyeball your paper. Do you have a lot of sentences that begin with "there are"? Typically, that's a weak way to begin a sentence. You can rephrase it and get rid of those extra filler words. Also, do a lot of your sentences start the same way? If a lot of them start with "I," that's not ideal. If a lot of them start with "it," that's not ideal. Or if you just start the sentence with the same subject, right? You say, "the writer states," that can be really tired and redundant. Use transition words, furthermore, hence, in addition, indeed. Use ones that you're comfortable with and that flow with your writing and that fit your personal style as a writer. Don't forget those transition words. And yes, there's a lecture on transitions you can look at if it's been a while since English 101. Remove announcements. So one of the quickest things you can do, the easiest things you can do to elevate your paper is to go through it with a red pen or any color pen and look for places where you announce your intentions. In a presentation, that's totally fine. That's part of the convention, right? Today, I'm going to talk about such and such. In academic writing, or really in most kinds of writing, you'd want to avoid announcing your intentions because it's redundant and it doesn't sound scholarly. So get rid of these phrases. I'm going to argue, I believe, right? I believe is redundant anyway because we know you believe it since you're writing it. This quote means, or the writer quotes. In fact, the word quote should never appear in your paper. Quotes are good. I talk about quotes all the time. The essay prompt mentions using quotations, but you actually should not use the word quote. You don't want to use it because it's not academic, right? Quote is just a shorthand for quotation. Also, it's just not customary to reference the word quotation itself. Avoid things like what this means to me, or I'm going to talk about, or the dreaded what the writer is trying to say. A lot of times after a student introduces and integrates a quotation from the scholar, which is good, of course you want to integrate quotations from the scholar, but you don't want to use the word quote to do so. The student will say something like, what the writer is really trying to say is such and such. Now that sounds a little bit demeaning to the writer, right? If you're citing an epidemiologist from Yale and you say what the writer is trying to argue, it suggests that the writer is not really doing a very good job. So it's kind of demeaning. And also a lot of times when students begin their analysis of a quote with a sentence like that, they end up oversimplifying what the writer is indeed trying to say and might be saying very effectively. So remove any of those announcements, the word quote, and first person, unless you're using a first person example, right? There are some cases when you might want to use first person, when you might use that choice, even in an academic scholarly essay, even in your research paper. Avoid cliches. We've talked about these a little bit in this class. Things like at a loss for words, or raised a few eyebrows, or easier said than done. Get rid of cliches. Those are tired expressions that have been worn out. Comb through your writing for cliches and get rid of them. Avoid slang in formal writing unless you're going to subvert the slang term or talk about the history of the word or use the slang term in an interesting way, like you're going to unpack the slang term. You generally shouldn't do that in formal academic writing. So words like vibe, the writer had a good vibe, or 24/7, or even cool, those are slang terms. We don't want to use them in academic writing unless we're doing something, unless we're analyzing that word or subverting that word somehow. On the flip side, you want to avoid pretentious language. That doesn't mean I want you to have simple, boring sentences, not at all, but it means that your words should clarify rather than obscure. If you're just throwing in big words just to fulfill the word count or to sound smarter, it's going to backfire. So here's a couple of examples. Jimmy and his brother do not interrelate in a harmonious manner. Come on. You're talking about some guy, Jimmy, and his brother. You don't need to say interrelate in a harmonious manner. So here's where you want to have some sense of decorum. What you're talking about. Does the subject matter warrant this kind of over-the-top language like harmonious manner and interrelate? Not really, because you're talking about some guy's relationship with his brother. Splendid opportunity to get some slumber. I would say just get rid of the word splendid altogether. In my opinion, it's kind of a stupid word, but that's just me. When my writing implement malfunctioned, I asked the teacher for another to utilize. Utilize always makes lists of words that teachers don't like. Just say use. It means the same thing. Utilize doesn't sound fancier. And writing implement, what are we talking about here? A pen. We're talking about a pen that broke, not nuclear fission, not some complicated literary text. So you can call it what it is, a pen or a pencil. Again, this doesn't mean use simplistic language, not at all. There is a time and a place for precise language. Use precise language, but don't use two mediocre or several pretentious words when one simple word will do the job. Avoid jargon and euphemisms. We've also mentioned these in this class a little bit. Remember, jargon, those are words that are specific to an industry. All sorts of different industries and different fields have different jargon or terms that people use that lay people might not know, like the word pedagogy for teaching, or AWOL. Or if you're going to business school, something like manage the optics, right? We want to avoid that kind of jargon unless you're writing to a specialized audience. And then, of course, euphemisms. These are words that gloss over or kind of sugarcoat hard realities. Things like economically disadvantaged. It's okay to say poor. Humbled by this honor. That's one of my least favorites. Really what the person means to say is, I'm proud of this, but instead they say humbled by this honor. Told an untruth. What does that mean? A lie. Now, there are some times when somebody might unintentionally lie, right? Then it might make sense to say told an untruth. But if you're trying to sugarcoat a lie, don't call it a lie. Armed intervention, you could say battle or war. Now, I've had students in the military tell me that there are certain scenarios that are armed interventions and it means something a little bit different. If that's the case, then you can use it. But think about how you're using these words. Are you sugarcoating something? Are you glossing over something? We don't want to do that. We want to aim for precision in our writing. Use active verbs and avoid passive voice. Generally in academic writing, active voice is preferred. This is always true in English classes. In some other fields, this is not true. So in some subjects, and especially in some science subjects, they actually ask you to use passive voice. It's a little bit colder and more clinical. But in English classes and in many other classes, you want to use active voice. When the subject of the sentence is doing the action or performing the action of the verb is an active voice. So here's an example. The troops invaded the country. What's the verb? Invaded. Who's doing the invading? Who's doing or performing the verb? The troops. Remember, the subject of a sentence is whatever is doing the verb. So the troops, that's the subject. The verb is invaded. The first thing that pops into my head when I read this sentence is an image of the troops doing something, invading, right? That's active voice. That's ideal. If we flip that around, when the subject of a sentence is receiving the action of the verb is said to be in passive voice. Just like being passive in life isn't always a good thing, using passive voice in writing isn't always a good thing either. It's better to use active voice. So if you say something like, the country was invaded by the troops, we've put the actor in the sentence, the troops, at the end of the sentence, right? We also have filler words like was and by. It's a passive sentence. It's a weaker sentence. If I were a politician trying to downplay my troops, what my troops were up to, then I might choose to use passive voice. But we don't actually want to write like politicians. We want to be crystal clear when we're speaking. We generally, there's always exceptions to the rule, we generally want to use active voice. Or even something just like this that takes out the actor altogether. The country was invaded. We don't know who invaded the country, right? So this is an example of passive voice. Again, if you're trying to evade something, if you're a lawyer or a politician, there's probably some times when you want to use passive voice when you're trying to kind of pass the blame on to somebody else. But for academic writing, for English classes, generally we want active voice. Also, you'll notice active voice has fewer words. So we get rid of the was. Was is not a particularly interesting verb, helping verb, and we get rid of the by. So we're eliminating filler words that didn't really do anything for the sentence. Think about your verbs. So more on kind of along the lines of verbs, think about what verbs you're using. In general, it's best to use really strong, specific verbs. And when you can, sometimes you can't avoid it, but when you can, avoid to be verbs, right? Remember, verbs can be actions like kick, run, jump, but they can also be states of being like am, is, are, was, were. So try to skip those when you can. Flip it around to use a more interesting verb. And then use the same verb tense throughout your entire essay when possible, when you can. Generally, you want to pick a tense and stick with it. Typically, for essays in English classes, you use what's called the literary present. Even in this class where we're not really writing about literature, we're writing about rhetoric, we want to use the present tense. So we would say the author writes, not the author wrote. Most of the time, right, as a rule of thumb. More important than that, sticking with the same tense throughout your essay whenever you can. So be consistent with your verb tense. Avoid unnecessary words and intensifiers. Here's a list of a couple that you want to get rid of in your writing. True fact, that's redundant. Facts are supposed to be true. I saw it with my own eyes. How else would you see it? Innocent bystander. A bystander by definition is someone who's innocent. Ask the question. I make this mistake all the time. I say, ask the question. Well, that's redundant. I shouldn't say that, right? Ask the question. Ask means to ask a question. In the event that, just get rid of that altogether. Personally, I feel, that's the definition of personal, right? How you feel. Equal to one another. It's redundant, just say equal. Extremely small. So this isn't redundant, but it's what's called an intensifier. Extremely small. Small is not a particularly vivid word. Extremely is not a particularly vivid word. In fact, generally it's best to avoid adverbs and adjectives when possible. That's kind of a controversial point, but when possible, avoid excessive use of adverbs. Typically those words end with ly. Instead of saying extremely small, pick one word that means the same thing, but that's even more precise, like diminutive or tiny, right? Pick a better word. And then, of course, blend together. That's redundant. Just say blend. Practice concision. So I think it's pretty easy for a lot of us to get to 5 pages or even to get to 10 pages. A lot of us have the opposite problem. We write a 15-page research paper when it's supposed to be a 10-page research paper. It's a good problem to have, I suppose, because it means you like to write or you have a lot of ideas. But most of us need to pare our writing down. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of sentences that are not concise. In this paper, I am planning to describe the hobby that I enjoy of collecting old comic books. So that's incredibly wordy. You can eliminate a bunch of words and not lose the meaning of the sentence. I enjoy collecting old comic books. It's not a beautiful sentence, but the previous sentence didn't have anything else in it that was adding to the sentence's value or the power of the sentence. Or this one, I would like to tell you, my reader, about the ways in which the narrator has to convince himself that he is not insane and that he is totally sane. If you've read The Telltale Heart before, you can probably guess that this is about Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. So almost all of that can be eliminated. I would like to tell you, my reader, that's an example of an announcement. Get rid of it. The narrator has to convince himself that he is not insane and that he is totally sane. That basically means the same thing, right? So you could, instead of using all of those extra words, you could just say something like, the narrator has to convince himself that he's not insane, right? Not a beautiful sentence, but you'll notice that the sentence before was clunky and it didn't add anything. Select better words. So go through and look for places where you can pick a more precise or more powerful word. This does not mean using the thesaurus feature on your computer and plugging in a random word that you find on the thesaurus. You're going to end up sounding like a robot if you do that, and then it's very obvious to the reader that you just clicked thesaurus on every 5th word or something. So don't do that. But do use your thesaurus and search for a word in certain cases, maybe every couple pages or where you find that you have some words that are kind of vague. Use your thesaurus as a tool, but don't just pick any random word that the thesaurus generates, because the word might actually mean something a little bit different. It might have a different connotation. So use it, but then you have to actually use your brain and decide if the word makes sense there. Generally, these are words you want to avoid. Thing. Almost always, there's a better word. Very, just get rid of very altogether. Really, get rid of that. That's an intensifier. You don't need it. Essentially, that's on the list of most teachers' most hated words, essentially. In conclusion, we know it's your conclusion because it's your conclusion, so get rid of in conclusion. To sum up, that just sounds like kind of juvenile high school writing. Society. Now this one is tricky because there are some times when you have to use the word society. In fact, even for your research paper prompt, I use a word like society. Actually, I think I use the word culture. So society, sometimes you might have to use it, but typically there's a more specific society that you're talking about. Society just means any group of people. So instead of saying society, you might say something like millennials living in Southern California, if that's who you're talking about. Narrow down which society you're talking about. Unless you're talking about the entire society of the world, you can narrow it down. Get rid of the word quote. I should see lots of quotes, an analysis of quotes in your essay, but I shouldn't actually see the word quote. Now, you're going to see me use the word quote when I respond to your essays, right? But in your writing, you shouldn't use it, right? Because you're going to be writing an academic essay, but I'm going to be responding to your essays. So I might use the word quote, but you shouldn't use it in academic essays. Of course, if we're talking in class, absolutely use the word quote. For homeworks, you can use the word quote, but for formal essays, you shouldn't reference the word quote. And then this one, throughout human history, or any kind of sweeping generalizations that just sound kind of like baloney writing. Since the dawn of time. Those type of introductions or those type of sweeping, dramatic generalizations, they tend to backfire because they are so cliche. I can't tell you how many essays I read that begin with some sort of sweeping statement like that. And I am not above this. I remember very vividly when I was a student in college, a professor crossed out the first line of my essay. I think I started my essay with something like "since the dawn of time" and wrote cliche, and I was so outraged and so offended, but now I get it. It is a very cliche way to start essays. You can do so much better than that. I know you can. And then my final tip, this might be the most important thing, even though it seems so obvious. Read your essay out loud. You need to print it out. I know this is annoying. Getting your printer up and running is a huge pain. I get it. But you will be amazed at what you find when you print it out and you have it on a piece of paper. Get out a pen and then read your essay out loud. You might just read it once through and then go back and fix any errors, or you might read it paragraph by paragraph. But I can almost guarantee that you will find some errors or some typos when you read your essay out loud. And oftentimes when you say things out loud, you realize, oh, that just doesn't sound right? When I read it, it sounded okay, but now that I'm reading it out loud, it sounds kind of funky. Then revise and then repeat the process. Read it out loud once more. I highly recommend this. Some people use the strategy of reading the essay backwards. That doesn't mean reading the words backwards. It means reading the conclusion and reading your last body paragraph. That's never really worked for me, but it works for some students. They find things that they wouldn't have found before. We don't want to fall in love with our writing, with our own writing so much that we refuse to edit or we refuse to think of different ways of wording something. So I recommend if you have someone that you can read your essay to, like a friend or a roommate or even a parent, read your essay out loud to that person, even your dog or your mirror or anyone willing to listen to your essay. That can be really helpful. There are links to some of the other lectures that I've mentioned here. So if it's been a while since you've taken English 101 and you don't know these comma rules or these rules about passive voice versus active voice, there are links below this lecture on the module that you can go back to see some of those lectures.